There are no roads leading here. That's not a metaphor. It's a fact. A geographic, administrative, deliberate fact that most Canadians will never have reason to think about. Canada sells itself, has always sold itself, as a country of space and possibility. Clean lakes, social services, universal health care. The idea that if you work hard enough, the system will meet you halfway. But there's a version of Canada that nobody puts on a brochure. A version made of roads that end without warning, of hospitals that closed 15 years ago and were never replaced, of governments, federal, provincial, both, that looked at a community of real people and quietly decided, not our problem anymore. This video isn't about ghost towns. Ghost towns are empty. The places on this list are not empty. That's exactly what makes them so hard to look at. If you drive north from Timmins on a Thursday afternoon, the city fades in a way that doesn't feel dramatic. It just thins. The houses get older. The streetlights get further apart. The roads lose their markings before they lose their pavement. Timmins made its name on gold. In the early 20th century, the Porcupine Gold Rush drew thousands of men into the Boreal with picks and ambitions, and the city that grew around those mines became one of the most productive gold-producing regions in Canadian history. For decades, the northern districts, where the original mining families settled in the 1940s and 1950s, were full of exactly the kind of working-class life that built this country's mythology of itself. That life is largely gone now. The mines consolidated. The men who didn't die in them retired somewhere warmer. The companies moved on. But the houses are still there. Dark wood, blackened further by decades of northern winters. Streets where the municipal lighting has been out for years, not temporarily, just permanently unrepaired. And in those houses, families who will tell you, if you ask, that they are not leaving because their father is buried in the yard. Not in a cemetery, in the yard. Because that was what you did once, in places where the ground was yours and the government was far away. There's something in that detail that takes a moment to settle. A burial in the yard. It sounds like another era entirely. And in many ways it is, except the people living beside that grave are alive right now, in 2025, in a country with a Charter of Rights and a welfare state and a national healthcare system that is, technically, supposed to reach them. Timmins proper still functions, but its northern margins exist in a kind of administrative shadow, and the families there have learned, over generations, not to expect the shadow to lift. Flin Flon sits directly on the provincial border between Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Its main street crosses the boundary line. Some residents live in one province and work in the other. It sounds like a quirky geographical footnote, the kind of thing that makes for a good trivia question. It's considerably less quirky when you need an ambulance. The copper mine that founded Flin Flon in the 1920s employed the town entirely. The Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting Company wasn't just the main employer, it was the town. It built the housing, maintained the infrastructure, ran the services, which meant that when the mine finally closed, it didn't just take jobs. It took the entire logic of the place. Population has dropped from around 10,000 at its peak to roughly 5,000 today, and the trajectory hasn't stabilized. Young people leave for Winnipeg or Saskatoon. The businesses that serve them follow. What remains is a city that has been applying to 2 provincial governments for infrastructure support for decades, and which both governments treat as, essentially, the other one's jurisdiction. The families that have been here for 4 generations don't describe this with bitterness, particularly. It's more like a fact of weather. You learn to route around it. You learn which services you can expect and which you cannot. You build mutual aid systems that the government would have provided if the government had ever fully decided Flin Flon was its responsibility. It hasn't, and probably won't. Some places are abandoned by accident. Leaf Rapids was abandoned by design. It just took a few decades for the design to reveal itself. In 1970, the federal government built Leaf Rapids from scratch, literally from nothing. The plan was meticulous. A model northern town, purpose-built to house workers for a nearby nickel and copper mine. The architects won awards. The urban planners wrote papers. It was supposed to demonstrate that you could create a humane, functional, modern community anywhere in Canada, even in the subarctic. The streets are wide. The public squares are generous. The community center is large enough for a population 3 times the current one. You can see, in the bones of the place, the outline of a vision. 10,000 people, maybe. Families with children in good schools. A small but complete city. Walk those same streets now, and the vision feels like a haunting. The squares are mostly empty. The schools have merged and shrunk. The community center hosts functions for a fraction of its intended capacity. The mine closed in 2002, and the government that had built Leaf Rapids with such visible pride simply stopped investing. Nobody left an official notice. Nobody held a press conference to announce that the project was over. The federal government just redirected its attention, and Leaf Rapids began the long, quiet work of being a city designed for something that no longer exists. The families that stayed aren't confused about this. They understand exactly what happened. They just don't have anywhere obvious to go, and some of them don't want to go anywhere at all. The place, whatever its origins, is theirs now. The government's abandoned dream became their home. That transformation happened without anyone asking their permission. There's a certain kind of place that tells you what it is before you even arrive. Uranium City is one of those places. Founded in the early 1950s during the post-war rush for nuclear material, the city grew fast and bright and artificially, the way places do when an industry needs them urgently. At its peak, it held 5,000 people. Schools, churches, a small hospital, a sense of permanent future. Then the uranium market collapsed. The mines closed in 1982. The provincial government flew in planes and airlifted hundreds of residents out. One of the more dramatic and less discussed evacuations in Canadian history. Most people left. The infrastructure was left to decay. The province did not maintain what it had built. Fewer than 100 people remain in Uranium City during the winter months. There is no road connecting the city to southern Saskatchewan. The only access is by air and seasonal ice roads. If you have a medical emergency in December, the response time is measured in hours, if you're fortunate. Most of the families who stayed are Dene, Indigenous people who have lived on that land since long before anyone discovered uranium beneath it. And they will point out, if you give them the chance, that the city of Uranium City is what disappeared. The mines are what disappeared. The white population, the government infrastructure, the institutional presence, those are what were evacuated. They didn't leave because they were never really part of the thing that left. The land is theirs. It has always been theirs. The boom and bust cycle of a southern industry came and went around them like a weather system. And now they're still there, in a place that Statistics Canada lists as having too few residents to even report demographic data. That's one way to be invisible. The city around you simply evacuates and takes the census with it. Before we go further, there's a question worth sitting with for a moment. The question this whole video is circling around. What does it mean to choose to stay somewhere? Pikangikum is a First Nations community in northwestern Ontario. There is no permanent road connecting it to the rest of the province. In winter, an ice road opens across frozen lakes. A few months of access, then nothing. The rest of the year, the only way in or out is by plane. The community has been under boil water advisories for extended periods. Government reports have documented the conditions repeatedly. The federal government has known, in formal documented terms, that Pikangikum lacks adequate water infrastructure for decades. The families there have not left, and it would be easy, too easy, to frame that as a choice. A profound, even admirable commitment to land and culture, which it partly is. The territory has deep spiritual and ancestral significance. The connection between the community and that specific landscape is not something that translates into the utilitarian language of cost-benefit analysis. But flying out of Pikangikum requires money that many families don't have. Resettling somewhere requires a rental market that is accessible, an economy that will employ you, a social network to absorb you. Those things are not free. They are not guaranteed. They are not waiting. So when we say the people of Pikangikum choose to stay, we need to be honest about what that means. It means they stay in the face of conditions that the government has formally acknowledged and consistently failed to fix. It means the choice exists within a set of constraints that the government itself created and maintains. That's not nothing. It matters what we call it. Most places on this list were abandoned. Cassiar was erased. The distinction matters. Cassiar was a mining town in northern British Columbia. Asbestos, primarily, which tells you something about the era. At its peak in the 1970s, it had roughly 3,000 residents. Schools, a curling rink, a small hospital, the entire social infrastructure of a functioning small Canadian city. When the mine closed in 1992, the company that owned it, Cassiar Mining Corporation, made an unusual decision. Rather than simply shutting down and walking away, leaving the town to whatever fate abandonment usually brings, they bought the properties back from residents, and then they demolished them. House by house, building by building. The company's stated rationale was avoiding future liability for maintenance. Cleaner to erase than to abandon. A few families refused to sell. They watched as the town came down around them. Foundations appeared where houses had been. The streets emptied. The store closed. The curling rink was taken apart. And they stayed. In houses surrounded by the negative space of a community that had been deliberately removed from existence. There's a legal and philosophical question buried in that experience that nobody has ever satisfactorily answered. If a corporation can purchase a town and unmake it, what protections exist for the people who refuse? The answer, in Cassiar's case, was none that mattered. The families who stayed found themselves inhabiting the ruins of a deliberate erasure, not the natural decay of a place that time had passed by, the surgical removal of a community by a balance sheet. The Cree community of Uje-Bugumu was displaced 7 times in 50 years. 7 times, mining companies or government projects determined that the land the community occupied was more valuable without them on it. 7 times, the community moved. Each relocation was presented as necessary, temporary, manageable. Each one left the community with less territory, less stability, less institutional trust. The 8th time, they refused. This wasn't civil disobedience in the dramatic sense. There were no cameras, no international observers. The community simply said, "We are not moving again." And then they did something remarkable. With no federal funding, actively denied federal support, in fact, they designed and built their own town. Not a settlement, a town, with architecture informed by traditional Cree building principles, with a layout that reflected how the community actually organized itself, rather than how a southern urban planner imagined they should. Uje-Bugumu exists today because a community built it themselves, from the knowledge they'd accumulated being displaced 7 times, using that knowledge to create something that couldn't be so easily taken. The United Nations has cited it as a model of Indigenous community planning. What's striking, when you look at the actual timeline, is how recent this is. The town was built in the 1990s, not the 1890s, not some distant historical era when Canada was still figuring out its relationship to Indigenous peoples. The 1990s, within the lifetimes of people who are middle-aged right now. 7 displacements. Then the decision that there would not be an 8th. Sometimes permanence isn't about refusing to leave. It's about building something that can't be taken away again. In 2011, Attawapiskat declared a housing emergency. The images that followed were broadcast nationally. Overcrowded houses, failing infrastructure, conditions that looked, people kept saying this, like a developing country. Politicians made statements, reporters flew in, investigations were launched. Then, as these things go, the news cycle moved on. The coverage was real. The conditions were real. The emergency declaration was real. But there's something the coverage almost never addressed. After every emergency, after every declaration, after every devastating report, the families of Attawapiskat are still there. Not because the conditions improved dramatically. Not because the federal government solved the problems the 2011 crisis exposed. They're still there because Attawapiskat is home. Because the James Bay coast is where their families have lived for generations. Because the land, the language, the community, these are not things you can simply redirect to a different postal code. There's a pattern in how Canada covers communities like Attawapiskat. The crisis arrives. The crisis is documented. Promises are made with varying degrees of sincerity. The crisis becomes less acute or simply less visible. And then the community is left to manage, largely on its own, until the next crisis is dramatic enough to attract attention again. The families know this pattern. They've watched it repeat across generations, and they stay, not because they're waiting for the government to finally get it right, but because staying is, itself, a form of assertion. We are here. We have always been here. The crises are yours to explain, not ours to disappear from. In 1919, the federal government rerouted the water supply of Winnipeg. The infrastructure project required redirecting flow across Shoal Lake, which sits on the Manitoba-Ontario border. The engineering worked. Winnipeg got its water. The city grew. For over 100 years, the taps of Winnipeg have run clear because of what was built at Shoal Lake. The engineering also made Shoal Lake 40, a First Nations community of the Anishinaabe people that had lived on that land for generations, into an island. Not a natural island, an artificial one. A cut was dug, water was redirected, and the community found itself surrounded. For more than a century, there was no road connecting Shoal Lake 40 to the mainland. An ambulance from Winnipeg had no way to reach the community by land. Emergency services operated via water taxi in summer and ice road in winter, when conditions allowed. The community was placed under a boil water advisory that lasted for over 2 decades. Let that sit for a moment. The water infrastructure that gives Winnipeg clean tap water passes beside a community that couldn't drink its water safely for 23 years. A road was finally completed in 2019. It was called Freedom Road. The name tells you something about what its absence had represented. The community of Shoal Lake 40 did not receive an apology for 100 years of isolation. They received a road, and they're still there, as they have always been, on land that the government turned into an island to serve a city that grew prosperous on the water that flows past them. Some forms of permanence look like endurance. Some look like refusal. Sometimes they're the same thing. There is a place in northern Quebec that does not appear on municipal maps. Not because it was never inhabited, because the government, systematically and over many decades, declined to formally acknowledge it. The settlement is visible on satellite imagery. Structures, pathways, what appear to be gardens, the physical evidence of organized, sustained human habitation. The people there are mostly Innu. They have been in that territory since before Canada existed as a concept. They have burial sites there, seasonal hunting routes that have been used for generations, a school that functions on whatever combination of community resources and informal arrangements can be made to work. There is no official name for the settlement, no postal code, no municipal designation. It does not appear in Statistics Canada's database. It does not appear on federal maps of inhabited places. It exists in the administrative language of the Canadian state as unincorporated territory. In practice, that designation means the government does not count you, does not include you in service planning, does not route emergency services toward you by default, cannot easily be asked to account for your conditions, because officially, your conditions don't exist in any category that generates accountability. This is the endpoint of a logic that runs through every place on this list. The erasure that began with a mine closure, or a road not built, or a service quietly discontinued. In its most complete form, it looks like this. A community that is alive, inhabited, generationally rooted, and simply not on the map. Not because no one could see them, because someone decided, repeatedly and consistently, not to look. The Canadian map is a document. Like all documents, it tells you as much by what it omits as by what it includes. Every blank space that isn't actually blank. Every unmarked road. Every community that exists without the administrative recognition that would make it legible to the state. These aren't cartographic accidents. They're decisions. Somewhere between Timmins and a nameless settlement in northern Quebec, between a town built for a future that evaporated and a community made into an island so a city could drink clean water, there is a version of Canada that the official version has chosen, very deliberately, not to see. The families in these places have not made the same choice. They see it clearly. They live in it every day. And they stay, for reasons that range from love of land to lack of alternatives, from political refusal to ancestral obligation, from sheer stubborn fact of being rooted somewhere so deeply that leaving would require becoming someone else entirely. Whether that staying is freedom or its absence, that question doesn't have a clean answer. And maybe that's exactly the point. A country comfortable enough with the question could ask it openly, could look at these places and say, "We see you, and we are responsible for what we've done and left undone." Canada has not asked that question, not officially, not yet. The families are still waiting. Or they've stopped waiting. Or, and this might be closest to the truth, they never expected an answer in the first place.